everybody and everybody on Zoom. I'm so glad that you're all here. We have a great panel. As Sarah mentioned, am Leona Oceania. I serve on the board of the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Maine. I also serve on the national board of the Funeral Consumers Alliance. And I am the founder and sole person of Die Well Death Education. Our panel today, I'm going to introduce everybody just by names and really basic knowledge, facts, and then I'll let everybody kind of expound upon who they are and what they do. This is Mel Bennett. She is the founder of Life Forest Cemeteries. There is one in Hillsborough, New Hampshire, and a new location in Auburn, Maine. This is Chuck Lakin. He is the home funeral guide guru of Maine and my mentor and hero. Sorry. This is Tony Antolini. He was the former president of the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Maine up until about a year or two ago. And he is also heavily involved in the Mid-Coast Green Set. What is it?
Mid-Coast Maine Green Burial.
Mid-Coast Maine Green Burial, and they are working very hard to establish a green burial location in Mid-Coast Maine, and I will let him expound on that. And lastly, we have Katie Raposta, who is are you the only person at the Direct Cremation of Maine, or is it your whole family?
No, it's my whole family. Tammy's one of my directors,
Perfect.
and so I'm one of the funeral directors
Okay.
manager.
And what I love most is that they are the only location in Maine that offer alkaline hydrolysis as a body disposition option, which is fantastic.
And have been doing it since
And
2010.
13 was when we were
13?
finally permitted, yes.
So I'll let her talk more about that, but it's just great. So I guess we'll start with Mel, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
And I think we all have about 10 to 12 minutes to kind of talk a little bit about who we are and what we do. And then we will open it up to questions, discussion, whatever you guys want to do. There you go.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mary Ellen. Everybody calls me Mel. And thankful to be here with you today, and hi to everybody on Zoom. So I co-founded Life Forest Cemeteries. We are cremation only, possibly composted remains as things progress and what we learn about that. We are in a conservation easement, and I do want to say that I came to this space much like each of you. I was a civilian or something, right? So I'm not from death care originally. I kind of found myself in death care because I had a passion project and I really wanted to bury my mother, who was cremated already, in a setting that was a little bit more natural than the large rolling cemeteries that we had in Lawrence, Massachusetts, where I grew up. So I felt the desire to plant a tree and memorialize her, but I really respect and wanted the traditional cemetery protections because she was very big into genealogy. And cemetery records are important. Vital records are important. And unfortunately, at the time, I could not find anybody or any cemeteries in the state that would allow me to do so. And that is where the desire started to form a way to be able to bury my mother, plant a tree, and simultaneously have and ensure that she was recorded with vital records, ensure that the land was protected, and that we would always know that the usage of the land would stay in perpetuity. So that's how it all began, and I was very, very intrigued and interested when I had met the owner who's here, Michelle, of Compassionate Composting, as I was learning in our New Hampshire location about this kind of new disposition option that I had no idea about, being natural organic reduction or terramation or human composting. There's a lot of different verbiage for it. And I wanted to understand it better, and to do so, I had reached out to Michelle. And she gave me the most beautiful tour of her outdoor large animal composting facility, which is the first of its kind in the country. And the amount of compassion that she showed for the animals that she served and the families that she served, as well as the amount of respect that she showed for the forests around her, grew my interest in understanding more, not only about what she offered, but it perked my interest in a partnership. And I'm very proud to say that Michelle and Chelsea, owners and stewards of Life Forest Auburn, Maine, decided to take this journey with me. And I'm very proud of that. So they will be available for questions around composting and what that is in the sense of large animal composting and how that may relay, and that knowledge may relay to human composting, if anybody has those types of questions. And as far as Life Forest, because we only serve people who have been cremated, which there are quite a few people that choose this, but not only that, quite a few people have become stewards of cremated remains. And not only have I found that one person that may choose cremation has now somewhat become 5 different sets of interments, because people will gift smaller sets of cremains for memorialization. So I would like to speak about any sort of questions that I had learned around legal protections and lack thereof of cremated remains. As a person who simply was somebody who lost someone that they loved, I assumed that my mother's ashes, so I would say it, were protected under law, right? But I didn't know that the last point of record was actually the crematorium. And after that, there is a lot of flexibility given in order to memorialize. You can produce a beautiful piece of glass or jewelry, or perhaps maybe shoot the person into space, or make a record or a tattoo or a stone. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that people can memorialize that may touch their heart, and that's wonderful. But the opposite side of that coin is that there are not necessarily legal protections as far as protection of space automatically granted. So in my mind, I had made the assumption that if I chose a burial spot, maybe a scattering garden, or that my mom's remains, in my head, that's what they were, her remains would be automatically legally protected. But unfortunately, as I created the cemetery in New Hampshire, I learned that there was no legal requirement around documentation of space or protection of space for scattering or any sort of burial, which I found that to be very upsetting, because it deemed to me that there could be an opportunity for places to kind of pivot direction in their approaches of how they serve people. And in that regard, I learned a lot about how to protect people in their space, in their rights to space, and how that's done appropriately. And I think that there are a lot of misconceptions around that and around automatic protections. And I want people to understand that they need to ask questions around their choices, right? So ensure that where you choose for burial is a state recognized cemetery so that you can record with vital records. That was the whole point, was the protection of genealogy. If there is a legal cemetery, and then you will automatically be required by the state. If somebody said, well, geez, there's no full bodies buried here and we really would like to now build a strip mall. We want to make sure that doesn't happen, right? So if you have a legal cemetery that's state recognized, there is a very strict process that needs to happen around discontinuance of the usage. So that's the first step, is ensuring state recognition of where you're choosing to bury or scatter. And then the other opportunities are given around protecting land through conservation. So learning about conservation easements, third-party watchdogs by pairing with an entity such as even a local conservation commission that manages that easement. As well as we had chosen to, instead of protect people's rights to space, give people rights to space. So we chose an approach that didn't exist yet, but we will take the latitude, longitude coordinates of somebody's burial plot and give them right-of-way access, which means that their burial plot now, of course, has a set of requirements, and you can't build a tower there, but you can always access it. And those vital records of those who are buried there are also recorded as an addendum on the deed of the land itself. So these are different ways in which people can form protections around some different ways of disposition. And full body burial, natural burial is a beautiful, beautiful way to bury. And a full body has some legal protections. But as different ways of disposition are offered, such as human composting, such as cremation, alkaline hydrolysis, which is also a very popular and nice way to choose. Just know when you're choosing a final resting place, understand the questions you need to ask, and I will be available to those. And thank you for hearing. I hope I didn't go over my minutes. Okay.
That was fantastic. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'd like to next go to Katie at the other end of the table.
This is the Zoom
Do I need to
microphone.
speak into that?
Yeah, I think that's for the room and then this is for the Zoom.
Hi. I'll give a little introduction of myself. Sorry about that, Tony.
That's all right, that's fine.
All right, I got you all caught up.
We're good.
Good morning. My name's Katie Rapasta, and thank you all for having me here. And I'm going to speak a little bit about alkaline hydrolysis, which is also known as aquamation, water cremation, and again, referred to as many different terms. I work for my family's funeral home in Belfast, Maine. Tammy, one of my other funeral directors, is here with me today. We have our own crematory in Searsport, Maine, which is 4 miles from our funeral home. My father started direct cremation in Maine in 1985, long before cremation was a popular option. As you can see, decades later, cremation is a much more socially acceptable form of final disposition. And a little over a decade ago, he started the process to purchase an alkaline hydrolysis machine, which is a machine that breaks down the human body through alkaline water naturally without the same emissions that you have through the flame cremation process. So after going through that process with the state of Maine, we became operable, so to speak. And I would say at the beginning, people were very skeptical about what the process was. It's scary, it's yucky. I've heard all of the different words surrounding this, but basically it speeds up what nature does to your body, breaking down your soft tissue, and leaving a sterile skeleton within 12 to 14 hours. So the machine that we have and the process that we offer is a low pressure, low temperature machine. That's why it's not a 3 to 5 hour process like the high pressure, high temperature machines you may have heard more about. It's a slow and gentle cycle where your body is placed in a basket, a stainless steel basket. The biodegradable shroud that wraps around your body is broken down completely. And during that 12 to 14 hours, as the water cycles around your body, your soft tissue is removed. At the end of the process, the effluent that is left, the water is a more of like a nutrient-rich water, basically. That is in Maine still discharged into wastewater. So it's not collected into large drums and given back to the family. But it's actually quite productive for, again, the water system. So once it's discharged, it doesn't cause any sort of problems for wastewater. The family would receive the same thing as you were mentioning before. People like to loosely say ashes, but the cremated remains or the pulverized bone tissue is then returned in an urn or some sort of receptacle that the family can opt to do with as they wish, scattering or burial or keeping at home. A lot of people think that during the alkaline hydrolysis process that the bone tissue is broken down. So that isn't the case. So I guess that was one of the main questions that I receive is, what do I get back? So you would still have an urn or some sort of receptacle with the cremated remain bone tissue left in there. And that's kind of the long and the short of the process. Getting back to when we started it, again, wish I could take the credit for myself, but my father has kind of pioneered like new things in death care for many years, obviously. So him going through this process of, you know, people moving toward being more environmentally conscious in their death. I think people are becoming, as you can see, more educated about the death process and what happens to your body and making informed choices instead of making rush decisions at a very acute grief period of time. So I think putting the alkaline hydrolysis machine in at the crematory was looking into the future, I would say, of what people were looking for, which was trying to leave maybe a lower carbon footprint in their death, if that's the way they live their life. Over the last decade, since we've gone through like kind of the kinks, let's say, being the first ones to be operable in the country that were actually operating as an alkaline hydrolysis facility, my husband was actually the one providing the service physically, doing the alkaline hydrolysis procedure. There was a lot of difference as far as like making sure the water was at like perfect alkalinity to break someone down, making sure the machine and all of the engineering was in place. But now, again, over a decade later, we have all of that pretty much ironed out. And it's nice to see more public acceptance of this process. Because I think initially when you think about liquefying soft tissue, and I think people are thinking, oh, that's really wild to think about in your mind, even though if you're in the ground, it's happening. They don't actually know what happens in flame cremation. So when I get that piece of feedback from consumers, you know, I'm not going to get into what happens in flame cremation either with them, but the method is certainly much more gentle than with flame cremation, just in the experience of what that body goes through. And the outcome is a much lower emission process, and we're not just putting, you know, propane and emissions up a stack. So I think it's certainly the future of where cremation is going, and I hope in another decade that it's much more widely selected than the flame cremation process itself. But again, it's conversations like these of people being educated about what happens to your body, what you're going to have left as something to memorialize, and what the expectations are for time. So in that, I think I've given you in a nutshell what the alkaline hydrolysis process is, and I would be happy to speak to you further about any questions that you may have afterward.
Correct yourself. Thank you so much.
Was that too long?
No.
Okay.
You're all doing good.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Next, I would like to turn it over to Chuck and Tony to talk a little bit about green berries.
Good morning or good afternoon, whatever it is. I represent an organization that is concentrating on the mid-coast area, but when I was invited to appear today, I was encouraged to talk about statewide presentations. So full disclosure, I am a member of the working group of Mid-Coast Maine Green Burial. As Leona said, I'm very glad to be back with you guys. I'm the former president of this organization, and I termed out in terms of board membership. So I left because I needed to, and I decided to devote my time to something closer to home. I live near Rockland in a little town called Cushing. Our goal is to establish a green cemetery somewhere in our area, but in order to do this, we've spent quite a lot of time looking at the entire state. It's important to know that there are other states in the country that are ahead of Maine, actually ahead of New England in terms of green burial cemeteries. Now, for those of you who don't understand that lingo, you've heard the word full body burial, natural burial. These are all different names for the same process, which is basically wrapping the body in some kind of shroud, usually produced locally, and put in a basket, or maybe not even a basket, and into the ground. It is fully legal in the state of Maine to do this, as long as soil conditions are correct for it. You cannot do it in an area that is close to a waterway. You cannot do it in an area that is within, I think, 250 feet of a well. The soil needs to be in a dry location. In other words, if it's a swampy area, this is not appropriate. So soil science has to play a role in the location of a green cemetery. The idea behind it that drives this movement is, with all due respect to Katie, to reduce the number of emissions from flame cremation. I can't speak to alkaline hydrolysis, but it certainly does cut down on emissions. But it's also to address another topic which hasn't come up this morning, which is conventional funeral procedures, which involve embalming. Embalming fluid is toxic to the soil. A cement grave liner involves a great deal of energy to produce and transport the cement. Sometimes an expensive casket. Often the casket is made of imported wood. All of these have green impacts. So the idea behind what we are trying to do is to create a cemetery or cemeteries where this is avoided and the body is buried in an old-fashioned way. Now, this is nothing new. I'm sure you've stopped to think that before, this is very approximate, before the Civil War, people were buried all over the place and simply put in the ground with a gravestone, or maybe not even a gravestone, and that was it. So we're trying to get back to an old practice. There's nothing new about it. So one of the things that might interest you is to know where you could see this in practice. And so I've broken this little presentation into parts. There are different types of green cemeteries. The first one is a conservation cemetery. Now, this is a place that is conserved land that has been set aside by a conservation organization. And the prime example here in Maine is Kennebec Valley Land Trust. They do not run this particular green burial ground. It's called Baldwin Hill. It's an offshoot of the Kennebec Valley Land Trust, and it's in the town of Fayette, which is near Augusta,
Farmington,
near
Yeah.
Farmington.
Farmington and when.
Yeah. It's a beautiful place. If you visited it, it would look like a park. What you would notice is that there are no gravestones of the traditional kind, no monuments. It's very, very beautifully kept. There are walkways that are maintained. And every body that is buried there has a GPS location so that that person's location can be documented. Now, that's the only conservation cemetery that I'm aware of in Maine. Chuck, pick
That's
me up
correct.
if I'm.
That's
if
the
I'm-
only one.
Okay. He's my fact checker. Next type that you might find interesting is a hybrid cemetery. This is a cemetery where conventional burials are taking place, and part of it is set aside so that the green cemetery practice can be maintained. And the best example near here is the Burr Cemetery in Freeport. There, you can be buried in a conventional way, or you can be buried in a green burial ground. They're right next to each other. You can visit these places. They are not closed to the public. There's another one called Greenwood in Bethel that I know less about. Then there are other types of green cemeteries. These can be run as a business, by the way. One of them is called Cedarbrook. It's in a town called Lymington, which I think is near Portland. And there was another one near Orrington, but it has now closed. You can still visit it, but they are not available for any further burials. Also, another type that's surprise to many people is the Southern Maine Veterans Cemetery. That's a green cemetery for all military veterans in this area. That's also open to the public. Then, of course, there are private cemeteries all over the place. There is nothing in state law that prevents you from burying your dear departed on your own land, as long as it meets the soil requirements. Oh, that's perfectly legal. However, not a lot of people have the right kind of land or enough land in order to do that. Then the final type is municipal cemeteries. This is a very slippery slope, and where most of my research is devoted. We have to check every single town and find out what their ordinances are. Now, they fall into three types. One is they don't want to talk to you. They find the whole thing repugnant. And there are some towns in our area where a lot of misinformation or disinformation is spread, such as we don't want it because animals will dig up the body, or grave diggers will come looking for jewelry. There is absolutely no evidence that this has ever happened anywhere. If you look at other states, such as the state of Washington, the state of Colorado, Tennessee, North Carolina, there are green cemeteries where there is no evidence that these graves have been robbed. Then there is a type of town, and we have several in our area, which is Knox, Lincoln, and Waldo counties, basically the whole mid-coast area. These are towns where they have allowed us as an organization to come and talk to the cemetery committee. And in some cases, they're actually quite interested. I won't name these towns now, but if any of you want to ask, I'd be happy to tell you. Some of them are moving in the direction of having a green cemetery in their own town. The next question, of course, is that cemetery only open to the people who live in that town, or are others allowed to be buried there? And usually the answer is yes, but they have to pay more. Then there is the most interesting category, and we have quite a few of these in our area, where there is nothing on the municipal ordinances one way or the other. So you ask the cemetery committee, is green burial legal in your town? And they scratch their heads and say, well, I'll get back to you. And they look and they find there's nothing in the records saying that you can't do it. Now, I would like to conclude by saying that one of the things we have found as we continue to research town by town and area by area is that there are burial sites all over the place in Maine that are green burial sites of historic significance. Some of them are marked, many of them aren't. But if you consider the fact that people have been buried in this state going back way before Maine became a state, there are green burials everywhere. So it's just a question of getting through the red tape to see when these towns will agree to it or say, well, we've never stopped doing it, go ahead. Thank you. Chuck?
As I was thinking more about what I was gonna be saying today, I was counting back the number of times that I've been asked to speak at the Funeral Consumers Alliance annual meeting. And I can clearly remember 4. And, I'm making wonder, aren't you people listening? I mean, I'm saying the same thing. Gotta get some new speakers around here. But I got into the home funerals as a direct result of my father's death, which was in 1979, which was a very personal experience right up until the time he died. He was at home and he was in his own bed with his wife and 4 kids touching him when he died. And I was waiting I wanted to be a part of whatever happened next, but I hadn't thought about that until it happened. And, at that point in 1979, I didn't know about any other option than call a funeral director, which is what we did. And he arrived promptly, zipped dead in a body bag, hauled him away. And 4 days later, we get a box of ashes in the mail. And I hated that. And then the fast worker that I am, about 20 years later, I ran across a manual written by Jerry Grace Lyons, who was making a business in California out of helping people take care of their own dead. And she also teaches classes and trains other people. And we have at least 2 of her graduates right here in this room. And so I started talking to people about all home funerals. I made my living as a reference librarian at Colby. And I wasn't trying to convince anybody to do a home funeral, but what I wanted to do was to have available the information someone would need in order to have the experience I wanted to have when my father died. And it just kind of grew from there. And so now we're up to a website that pretty much covers home funeral and other related topics. Build your own coffin. Yeah, we got that covered. That kind of stuff. And then I've been doing, for a long time, or let's say about 20 years, I was doing presentations around the state on the topic. A lot of adult ed programs or libraries, any place that would find people that would talk to you. And so I'm getting old, and I'm really glad that I ran across my successor here, who has taken what I did and decided that I was much too slow for the process. And so she's probably talks in 1 year, talks to more people than I do in 5. And so we got the information is still going to be there. But to talk about a home funeral, the process is perfectly legal. And it's very intimidating to a lot of people. But it's right up, what happens is you find an article that was written by somebody or a family that did a home funeral. It all starts with them talking about how unsure or insecure they were about trying to do this. I mean, how is this gonna go? And are we ready for this? But we're willing to try to let it happen kind of thing. And then they tell you the story about how it was going. And the last sentence in every one of them is some variation of, and we would never do it any other way. It's such a personal and profound experience. We just recently had the experience of a woman who called me up and said, my husband's dying, and he's probably gonna die within the week. And I've been talking to the funeral directors and everything seems so expensive and I want to take care of him at home. And how am I gonna do this? And so, I can help you out with this. And so got together, gave her some stuff that I might make it easier for him. And then she was worried because she has a large family, but nobody else in the family wanted to help her with this. And she was gonna have to do it by herself. And so she said, but I'm still gonna do it. And then, so he died. And on a Friday afternoon, which is the most inconvenient time if you want to get the paperwork done and anything else. But it's by no means not a really big problem because you can easily keep a body around for 3 days without any real difficulty. But so she started taking care of her husband. And then one of the cousins finally kind of wandered on over and kind of said, do you need some help here? And it finally broke the ice. The next thing, by 4 hours later, you had the whole family. Everybody was into it. They asked me to build a coffin for them, and they were decorating the coffin. They were taking care of this. They were doing that, and turned it into a real family thing. And then this guy was pretty well known in the area, and they had like 400 people at the funeral. And talk about advertising. So I'm sure there are a lot of people in the area that have been exposed to the idea and much more accommodating to it. And I've been talking about home funerals for so long that you can practically I don't have to think about the answers any longer, and it comes out, I figured out how to say it in the same way, and it just, okay, this tape comes right out. But I still, like I said, I was a reference librarian, and I encourage people to ask questions and guarantee you can't possibly ask too many questions. Anything else you need?
Nice segue to the question.
I think you could under your legs.
No, I can
There you go.
put my legs over my one ear.
This is going downhill now.
Thank you so much. Technically, I'm a presenter as well, and I just was going to talk about, well, first, I guess my credentials to some extent. I've trained as a home funeral guide with Jerry Grace Lyons, as an end-of-life doula, a death educator, and a life legacy facilitator. And again, I established DIWELL Death Education about a year ago, and it took off in ways that I never anticipated. I provide a number of death education series in Southern Maine, and I facilitate a number of death cafes as well. And one thing that I talk about ad nauseum is creating an end-of-life plan and preparing for your end-of-life death and body disposition. And I can't stress enough how much smoother it can, none of us know for the most part how or when we're going to die, but the more you prepare for it, the better chance you have of having a good death experience, both as an end of life experience, your actual death experience, and what you would like for yourself for body disposition. How many people have done an advance directive? Yay, excellent. How many people have done a will? Good, you guys are good. How many people think that's the extent of end of life planning? There's so much more. And it's really one of the greatest gifts that you can provide to the people that care about you. How many times have we seen family units just completely implode at the time of a, key person, matriarch, patriarch, some other person dying because people can't come together or unable to come together to decide what should happen in the moment or after the moment. So the best way to avoid all of that is to plan as much as you can, write down as much as you can, communicate. It's really not a good idea for your spouse to find out that your healthcare proxy is the mailman at the time of, it coming into play. So communication is really important. So I have a copy up here, a big stack of what I've created as a kind of template for an end-of-life plan, creating an end-of-life plan. You're welcome to take one now, later. Right now, I'm just going to go through it. I can talk about this for hours, but I'm just going to go through the bullet points. And then later, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to expound upon it. The one thing I do suggest that I think is a great resource, and I think a lot of people will agree, and it's not just because it's a product of the Funeral Consumers Alliance, but they offer an end-of-life planner called Before I Go, You Should Know. You can download it on their website and get an electronic copy for $9.99. And then you could do with it what you want. You might share it with your family. I didn't say that. So it's a great resource and it really walks you through a lot of what I'm going to mention here. And of course, one of the first top two are completing your advance directive and completing your final will and testament. And also, something that's important is your advance directive healthcare proxy, also a healthcare agent, healthcare power of attorney, it has different names. Their decision-making rights end at the time of death. So if you have really strong thoughts, and I, again, encourage you to write this down, think about it, write it down, about what you want for body disposition, you should really complete basically a disposition directive as part of your paperwork. In Maine, we're very lucky because it's included in the advance directive. It's actually page 11. But it also says right at the very top that this page is optional. So I think a lot of people, because it's already a heavy topic, they say, oh, well, I don't have to do that when I'm going to go to the next page. But naming a disposition agent enables someone to make these decisions and put this, whatever you want for yourself, alkaline hydrolysis, flame cremation, into play. Otherwise, it'll fall to your next of kin, and your next of kin may not be the person you want to be making these decisions. Create your last will and testament. Create a list of your phone and internet contacts. I usually recommend that you choose one key person from every important section of your life. Your work group, your church group, your knitting club, your golf club. Choose a key person and create a phone list so that the people that are closest to you when you die only have to call a small number of people, and then all of the information will get out from there, and they don't have to be calling a million people. They don't have to be worrying that they forgot to call Uncle Joe, that type of thing. Have all of your financial affairs in one place, all of your information, your bank accounts, your loans, your insurance policies, your retirement policies, your Netflix accounts, your anything that is being automatically pulled out of your bank accounts, even if it's small amounts, that's still going to continue to be pulled out of your bank account until either the Netflix account is closed or your bank account is closed. So it's a lot, but put everything you have that's money related into one place in your end of life file. The other part of that is that we are a password protected community now, and I can't keep up with my passwords on a regular basis, so it's really hard to keep my end of life password information updated. However, I would recommend that the most important passwords to keep up to date in your end of life file are the information to get onto your phone, into your computer, and into your email. And the reason for that is because even if you do click the I forgot my password link on another account, it'll probably send a two-factor authentication notice to your phone or your email, which will enable people to be able to get into the rest of it. Obviously, you want to only let a few key people in your life know about this information because it will contain all of your financial information and all of your passwords and whatnot. So be choosy about who knows where this information is, but please let somebody know where it is, because it won't do anybody any good if nobody knows where to find it when you die. On my website, I have a vital statistics for the death certificate form that you can fill out. A death certificate will need to be completed for every person that dies, and you would be shocked and amazed, and maybe Katie can speak to this, by how many people don't know all of the answers to the questions on the death certificate. And they all do need to be answered. You can't write, I don't know, or not applicable, or so you know all the answers. So I've actually created a form on, and it's available on my website, that corresponds with the main death certificate, where, you know, number one, when you write in your answer, it answers question number one on the death certificate. So you'll be the most popular dead person around when someone can just pull out of your file all the answers for the death certificate, and it's easy peasy. Legacy work is really important. It's also known as creating an ethical will. Who you are is important, no matter if you have 100 people who love you, or one person who loves you, or what, more people than one people love you. But it doesn't matter how many people are in your life. Who you are and what you've done and thought and accomplished, and your stories and your advice is important. And to document that in some way is, it's an important and valuable thing to do, not only for yourself, but for your people that care about you. And who knows, 100 years from now, you might be the most interesting person in the world, and people really want to know more about what you were thinking about. So documenting your stories, your advice, it's just important. Writing it down is probably the most durable way to have that as a lasting thing. There is also a lot of value to recording your, video recording. So there's a visual documentation of yourself, or audio. There's a lot of value that comes with people being able to hear and see you after you're gone. However, technology changes very quickly these days. So if you recorded all your life stories and best jokes on a cassette tape in the 70s, you're going to have a lot of trouble playing it now, but hopefully people will keep up with converting it over. You can write your own obituary, or at least make bullet points for writing your own obituary. Do it while you can control the narrative. Pick the picture you want to have in your obituary. In one of my classes, one of the most interesting things I had happen was this woman was talking about how she always imagined that in her husband's obituary, she was going to write about this, 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 and this. And then after sitting through one of the classes, they went home and talked about it. And he's like, I don't want you to talk about any of that stuff. I want you to talk about this, 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 and this. So, either write it out, or at least make bullet points for what you would like mentioned in your obituary. While again, you can control the narrative. And the other part about obituaries is it's okay. And I actually recommend that people kind of step outside the old formulaic thing of, he was, died surrounded by families, and he lit up the room, and he did this talk about, what he, look up Chris Connor's obituary from the Portland Press Herald from a few years ago. It's highly entertaining. It's okay to be funny. The obituaries that people talk about and remember are the ones that do have some humor in it, or are a little bit different. So it is, if writing the old, the standard form is what's right for you, that's great, but it's okay to kind of step outside and think outside the box. Do you want hospice involved at the end of life? think about this and write down your thoughts and feelings on it. If there's a specific hospice you would like involved, write that down. Just as a side note, hospice people are hospice eligible when they have a life expectancy of 6 months or less. That can be from a terminal illness, or it can be from advanced age, failure to thrive, that type of thing. People take advantage of hospice far too late as a general rule. The standard stay or utilization of hospice care is generally about 2 weeks, which is really unfortunate. Hospice provides only palliative care. Not all palliative care is hospice, but all hospice is all palliative care. And I'm happy to expound on that if you'd like. Would you like an end-of-life doula? An end-of-life doula can fill a lot of roles where there may be gaps in hospice care. An end-of-life doula is a non-medical support person for the end of life, very similar to a birth doula, which is a non-medical support person to the birthing process for a woman. This one I think is really important. Think about your pre-death vigil plan. As you're dying and possibly unconscious, what do you want happening? Do you want to be home? Would you like music? What music would you like? Would you like certain smells and scents? Do you want candles? Do you want to be touched? Do you not want to be touched? Would you like massage, Reiki? Do you want to be read to? Is there something specific you'd like read aloud to you? Do you want to be near a window? Would you like a windows to be open? Who do you want there? Is there anyone you don't want to have there? Leave as detailed instructions as you can while you can, and overall, what would you like to have happening as you are actively dying, and what would you like to not have happening during that time? Write it down, give your family a roadmap. It makes it easier for them, and it makes them feel better knowing that they're giving you what you'd like to have. Again, there's no guarantee that that's what's going to happen. I always envision in my head that, oh, as I'm dying, I want to be, and some of you maybe have heard this before. I want to be on my screen in my screen room, and the trees will be, blowing in the wind, and the birds will be singing. And then I think, oh no, what if I die in January? That's really gonna not be good. So, and then think about what you would like for a home funeral, or not, sorry, that was a Freudian slip. Think about what you'd like for a funeral service. or body disposition. And there are all different options for having a memorial service for yourself. You can have a home funeral. You can have a hybrid home funeral where you're working partially with yourself and your family, but you're involving a funeral home to do the paperwork and the body transportation. There are infinite options that you can do as far as a home. Sorry, there it is again, as far as a funeral.
Keep going.
And then body disposition in Maine, we're actually fortunate. We have more options than a lot of states. We have, of course, green burial. We have alkaline hydrolysis. You can, as Tony mentioned, you can be buried on your own property. Natural organic reduction was recently legalized. We don't have a facility yet. And then, of course, there are the most well-known options of full body burial and flame cremation. The last thing I do want to talk about is if working with a funeral home is what's right for you, I absolutely encourage you to go down that road. Be open to exploring home funeral options. It's, as Chuck said, it's not as overwhelming as you might think. And the last thing I do want to encourage you is that the Federal Trade Commission created a federal law in 1984 called the Funeral Rule. And it basically outlines your rights as an advocate within the funeral industry. And I just highly recommend that you familiarize yourself with what your rights are as an advocate within the funeral industry, and proceed accordingly if you are working with a funeral home.
Hello about the.
And the booklet, there's a booklet on the funeral rule. It's a little purple booklet at the back of the room. So feel free to pick one of those up and take it home. And that's all I've got.
You add one.
Yeah.
I
I just want to speak briefly towards some of these legal repercussions that we have around cremated remains, and cemetery keepers probably know this, but as we were learning about legalities in cemetery design, we had a death call. It was a gentleman who passed away that lived in New York. His nephew was the executor of his trust and was named the person that was going to be choosing his disposition option. As we were learning about this gentleman, we found out that he was, in fact, married. He had a same-sex spouse. The executor of his trust, his nephew, said, well, this is what we would like for him. We have his cremated remains. And I thought, okay, wait a minute, what about spousal rights? Like, what does his spouse want? Where is like, okay, if this person is choosing the disposition option, is this in alignment with what his spouse would have wanted? And we actually had to do quite a bit of legal research around this, because ultimately, the spouse wanted something as far as, you know, rights to be interred with his spouse. The family did not want to have that right given. So we embarked on a little bit of legal research, and I don't think it's well known that cremated remains are actually property. So we had to review all of this person's trust paperwork and see if his cremated remains were listed within his trust paperwork as the property of now his nephew, or whether or not it was not listed, and therefore the spousal rights are now the ones that we would legally turn to. So I'm not sure if that is a well-known thing. It was not in my knowledge until it came across our legal table as far as interment and legal cemetery law. But if you have a trust lawyer, your cremated remains or the families that you serve actually need to be listed as property within that trust if they want the person whom they've named the executor of the trust to be able to make choices around those cremated remains. Does that make sense? Okay, I just wanted to share that.
It makes sense, but just the fact that you have to do that doesn't make any sense.
I mean, these are the kind of the laws that we should really be aware of if we want to ensure that what we want is followed through on.
Yeah, I
What-
just wanted to ask, is it trust specifically? And trust has to do with property, right?
Yeah, I mean, this was a trust that contains the person's will, it was a trust lawyer that kind of enveloped all of their legal paperwork. And so the cremated remains would be part of the will.
And can I just expound on that and really quickly? It kind of piggybacking on that in a sense, creating or naming your disposition agent is also important. And the most extreme scenario would be if you are estranged from your biological family, who the people that are essentially your next of kin, and you haven't talked to any of them in 30 years, but you've created a whole other community here over here. And these people are your family, and they're ready to step up for you at the end of your life, and they've got all their wallets out and they're ready to pay for whatever body disposition option you want. If you haven't named one of those people as your disposition agent, then the rights of who makes that decision is going to go to whoever your legal next of kin is. And if they don't want to have anything to do with it, or they're not willing to step up and they go to the next person, and however long they'll try to get someone who's in the next of kin list, and nobody steps up, you can potentially become an unclaimed body, even though you have this whole group of people over here that have all their wallets out and are ready to do whatever you want, so. I guess,
I will speak to that briefly.
Yes.
That after a period of abandonment, they could step up.
okay.
So it is like the amount of hypothetical situations we could talk about just from those
Yeah.
two conversations are almost endless. So in all actuality, there's a lot more abandonment than you would think, that where family is just like, see ya, you're not gonna leave them on the side of the road.
Yeah.
So, but I will say, we do own and operate cemeteries out of state as well, but we deal with a lot of cremated remains and body custody issues, much more than we used to, like 12 times probably more than we used to. Where bottom line is, you don't always have access to a well when someone dies. They don't know where it is. They don't even know if they have an advance directive. So more than having all the papers is telling people. Because you can have every paper in the world signed, dotted perfectly in your safe deposit box. No one can access it. You've been cremated, you've been scattered in Penobscot Bay, and then they find this. So you can, there's just no way in no amount of time to cover every possible topic, but if you don't communicate to whomever that person is and they don't have a copy of that, nothing's gonna happen. And there's a lot of estrangement within families now. People are spread out and they have more family community. Sorry, Tony, I didn't mean to make
Sorry,
you feel
I'm
that
glad to be
way.
I'm good at this.
So, you know, in looking at that, it's, if you don't have it in writing and it's not communicated, we deal with this weekly, but sometimes even multiple times a day, where they've been partnered with someone for 3 years, which is now legally recognized in Maine. You don't have to have a registered domestic partnership. So whether you're married, live together, if you've been in a long-term relationship and you can prove that, you are considered the next of kin as far as the body disposition is concerned. And there's actually not a time on the new amendment to that law, there's not a timestamp on it. So if you're in a committed, provable relationship, it says for, it's an unspecified time, it says for a extended period of time, or a long-term relationship, which could be a year, could be 5 years. Like, I guess it would just be proving that you are considered their next of kin if you don't have advanced directives and things of that nature. So, and then on the cemetery law, I'm interested because my understanding is in most public cemeteries, you're purchasing the rights of disposition to that lot or that, you know, circle or however it is in your cemetery. So the person who owns that deed is the person who gets to say who's buried on that not kinship status. So when that's passed down generationally speaking, so I'm one of 3. So my parents own 16 lots. Myself, my brother and sister would all equally have to approve anyone buried on those lots, because we're being gifted that as far as like genealogy, you know, we're the next 3. So I don't know if that's how it's set up in your cemetery, but it is something that you would want to find out about, because that's cemetery specific, not state law. That would be for Maine. So it would be if your grandparents owned the lot and they didn't like your spouse and they don't want him there, you want to pick a different lot, you know? So just because then you don't get into that gray area of arguing and who's there. And we're dealing with that with, sadly, a family right now where brother is buried and the only living brother doesn't want the stone from his daughter there. So now that has to be removed and we have to exhume him. So it just gets really tricky if things aren't really clear about what that lot ownership is and who has the rights to burial there, because you don't own the land, you just own rights to burial there. So anyway.
My question was actually answered. The ongoing section.
Well, look at that. Does anyone else have any questions? And if you're on Zoom, feel free to raise your hand or write something in the chat or Sid.
The question on soil requirements, is the requirements for alkaline soil, acidic soil, clay, sand, as far as if you're doing a green burial? I believe it should only go no more than 3 feet down in order for a body to decompose. And is there a recommended soil type?
The question was on soil type for green burial.
Soil type.
Can I make a little amendment? The only reason why I want to ask specifically, because we were talking about this a little bit earlier. So green burial though, are we speaking about general green burial sites? Like are we talking about like if you went to his green burial cemetery or on your own property?
I'm talking about on family cemetery.
Okay.
you know,
So, and you can answer that because I've done a lot of home burials and there's been no deed restrictions on depth or soil testing. So as far as like, let's say in the last 6 months, I've probably done 5 green home burials. They're all on their own property. They're not in a registered green cemetery, but they are green cemeteries because they have no restrictions for embalming or vaults. And there's no depth requirement and no soil test required. So I think maybe that's specific to you creating a green cemetery. Is that the case? That would be more for public use?
What I can tell you is that I have access to a 12-page document that was written by the former Maine State soil specialist that outlines the different major kinds of soil in Maine and tells you whether they're suitable for burials or not. And if anybody would like to have a copy of that, you can, on the Last Things website, you've got my phone number and my email address. Yeah. Anybody else?
It's on your
Sid,
website.
I understand from my past association with you on the board that you have home burial plan, is
Correct.
that right? Could you tell everybody else how you work that out? Because there are some municipal requirements in terms of the deed. Could you explain how you did that, please?
Sure, it's not a municipal requirement, it's state law that you have to have no more than a quarter acre. And that you have to, it has to have some sort of fence around it. It can be stone, it can be a picket fence, whatever you decide, and you have to register it with the Registry of Deeds in the county that you live in. And you also have to have access to it in perpetuity. So if you decide that if you own a lot of land and you want to be buried on the top of the hill, you have to have deeded access that can get to the top of the hill, even if your heirs decide that they want to sell all these house lots and put it up there. So most of all the ones that I'm aware of have been basically closer to a road, a town road, so there's access going in there, and it's not in the right of way. It was a very simple process.
It's my understanding as well that the process varies from municipality to municipality. There are the state requirements as Sid just outlined, but the process by which the municipality may make you jump through more hoops and other municipalities may just be like, let's fill out these forms, you pay your fee and you're good to go. So that part differs.
My municipality had nothing on the record.
Yeah. Mine makes you go before the zoning board. So it's different everywhere.
We don't have to.
Oh, where do you live? I'm gonna move to that town. Adina.
So is that part of the process? Does an inspector have to come to the location that you want to be buried in your backyard to check it, to confirm that you're 250 feet from the water? Or is that something that's just part of this whole process that was just discussed?
No.
No, they don't. You do need to fill out paperwork, like the form I had to fill out. You had to indicate all of that information. My process, I had to get weigh in from all of my abutting neighbors, that type of thing. Sid, what was your?
I just had to follow the state and like, so a bunch of large stones and I went around on an area.
Yeah.
And,
I think you're,
basically, yeah.
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, my apologies. It's just if you do a diagram.
Yeah.
And you propose that with your, when you're doing registry of deeds, as long as you have a diagram showing you're deeded the right of way that will be deeded and showing the perimeter around the quarter of an acre, they don't need to physically come there, so, yeah.
Yeah, all I needed was the meets and bounds.
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, Austin County.
Mhm.
And you'd be surprised, I'm pretty sure that Chuck has experience with a woman within the Bangor city limits that was able to.
Yeah. This woman contacted me once and her husband was a professor at the University of Maine and owned a small foundation that had its office somewhere in downtown Bangor. And he wanted to be buried underneath the peach tree out in front of that office. And she got permission from the city to bury him there. That's all I can tell you about that.
Body burial remains,
Full body burial
green burial in his front,
in
in front of his office.
in front of that office. So, no matter what you want, ask. Except for the stuff that's stupid, and then just go ahead and do it. And, it's, as IBM famously said, it's easier to seek forgiveness than permission.
See. I have a question around the alkaline hydrolysis. It's a two-part question, and it's mostly around curiosity. At the end of that process where you have skeletal remains left, what's the texture of that? Is it still like absolutely like a bone, or is it chalky, or what? And also, if a person has parts and pieces like a metal plate or artificial hip or titanium, or I think my mom has a porcelain hip, I'm not sure. There's different things you could potentially have in your skeleton. Does that process have any sort of interaction with those elements, and can the family get all of that back, any artificial pieces back with the remains?
Sure, and is that both parts? Okay. Okay. So the question was, during the alkaline hydrolysis procedure, implants, any implanted devices, whether they're plastic, porcelain, titanium, any material during the alkaline hydrolysis, how does that interact with the process? And is that something that the family could obtain afterward? Is that pretty much what you asked? And what does the bone feel like? Sorry. So I'll start with that. So the afterward, it's a sterile skeleton. It's actually quite interesting. When you look in the basket, it's almost a whole skeleton. Not necessarily laid out perfectly like a human, but it's large pieces of bone tissue. And surprisingly enough, in flame cremation, it's the same. People think you just have this pile of ashes in the retort. That's not what it is. So when you open the basket, the sterile skeleton is there. The bone is wet. So it's not slimy, but you actually can see many different things regarding the bone, like what would look like cancer, things like that. So you can still see large pieces of the bone. It's usually like a greenish in color. And as it dries, it becomes whiter. So as the bone tissue sits in the air and is no longer being washed by water, the bone becomes whiter. So once the bone is dry, that's when it's then processed, which in any form of cremation, the bone is processed. It's a large stainless steel blade that grinds the bones to what people like to call ashes. So it's actually cremated remains, and that's like the consistency of crushed seashells. So it's as fine as powder and as thick as crushed seashells, if that makes sense. So to speak to the implants part, any implants are fine in alkaline hydrolysis. So we don't need to remove anything from your body other than like diapers, Band-Aids, plastic. So things that would be not able to be consumed in a natural environment of the alkaline water. So for instance, one person, this is an odd thing, had a penile pump. The whole thing came out, and it was all plastic. And so that whole thing of portacaths that you see that are implanted that are mostly metal and plastic for people with cancer or receiving treatments, hips, things of that nature. The part of that is if it's intact with the bone, it would have to be wait for the processing portion of that to obtain that. And I can't say that it would be completely free and clear of any piece of bone. So I would say the majority of families don't want those back, but we do have families from time to time that want Grammy's hip or, mom's plate that was in her head because it was a car accident that it means something to them. So those can be saved. They are sterile. So did I answer your full question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can those ever be reused, like in other medical procedures?
Well, pacemakers, yes. So pacemakers are not permitted in the US to be reused, but one of our medical examiners was working with, I think it was University of Michigan, and they were collecting the pacemakers and sending them to third world countries where they were legally able to be repurposed in animals and humans, actually. So depending on the battery life, I think it's about 10 years on the pacemakers. So if you've had it for 8.5 years, it probably doesn't make sense. But if you just got it implanted and then you pass away a week later, like that makes complete sense to repurpose that because it's a relatively expensive piece of equipment, I would assume, to purchase. Yeah.
Or would that just come out after?
Alkaline hydrolysis, it would not be removed till after because it's actually, there's long pieces of wire. So the leads that actually connect to your heart, wherever it's stimulating, go in too deep for us to topically remove that. So when I remove a pacemaker from someone who's going to be alkaline hydrolysis or green cremation, it's just a topical incision where we remove it from what your body creates as like a little pouch around it to, I guess, keep it safe, for lack of a better word. So that comes out and I clip the wires. So the wires are still left intact for flame cremation, but during the alkaline hydrolysis, the entire wire would come out. Yeah. Did that answer your question, both of you? Okay.
And if there are people on the Zoom who have questions, you can raise a hand or put it in the chat. And we only have the one microphone, so we're trying to rephrase the questions as they're coming in. And thanks for your understanding. So more questions.
Holly, I'm assuming, okay, so hospice very often is, insurance will cover that, so.
Can I assume though that if you were, if you wanted an end of life death doula, then that is not covered by insurance?
Correct. The question, statement / question was that hospice is covered by insurance, which is correct. Hospice is primarily funded by Medicare. Private insurances will also usually cover hospice care. You'd have to check with your agency. But end-of-life doulas are not. At this point, end-of-life doulas are, for the most part, a non-regulated offering, which has its positives and negatives. When you receive end-of-life doula training, you're getting a certificate, not a certification. So it is not recognized by the medical community. It is not covered by health insurance, Medicare, anything like that. Which again, it gives us the freedom to offer things in the way that we can offer them. I know doulas that accept bartering as payment, sliding scales. There's no regulation on how we have to do what we have to charge or how we have to, procure payment or whatnot. But of course, that also leaves it open that there may be some bad apples out there, which I'm sure they're not, but just kidding. So did that answer your question? Come on, you guys, you got lots of questions.
Chuck, oh, sorry, go ahead, Adina.
Who this would be for, or if anyone knows, but I'm wondering about a regular graveyard, where they embalm people and put them in cemeteries and stuff like that. The newfangled cemeteries, the post-Civil War embalming practice ones. Do you know if people can be buried in whatever coffin they want in a conventional cemetery, or like say somebody says, my friend makes willow coffins and I want to be buried in one of those? Is that allowed, or is it like graveyard by graveyard, just the decision of each place?
So the question, do you want me to repeat the question?
Yes.
Yeah, well,
Okay, so the question was about conventional cemeteries and their regulations, if it's a state law or if it's by cemetery, is that correct?
Yeah, can you do more of a green thing in a conventional cemetery? Or do they have to have the concrete and have to have the embalming?
You do not. So embalming is not required by state law and a vault is not required by state law, and any funeral director or funeral home should give you that information. So it is strictly a cemetery guideline. So if I'm gonna take you to Auburn Family Cemetery and it's just a privately owned cemetery, either by the city or by a family, they will have interment regulations. Those should be in writing and they should be able to provide those to you when you purchase your lot there. I can't think of a reason why they would require embalming to be buried in a regular cemetery, conventional cemetery. And I do that quite regularly, wash people's bodies, dress them, place them in a casket that they've provided. And if the cemetery requires a vault, which is very typical these days, just because of liability reasons, for instance, a vault is a concrete box that your casket goes in. So if you want to bring a homemade casket or a friend made a casket, or you want to buy one online, that is certainly your right to do that. That would go inside the vault or grave liner, which is just a concrete box that lines the grave. And over time, that keeps the ground from settling. So now in this day and age where most people use excavation equipment to roll across the graves and open the grave, if mom's been buried for 50 years and down goes the excavator through her bones, someone is liable for that, both for the mental and emotional stress and duress for the family that you went through their grave. So a lot of it has to do with liability. And that's actually an interesting question about your conservation cemetery. Baldwin Hill, we did a burial there. Tammy went out and she thought it was very interesting that it's a conservation cemetery, but they didn't hand dig the grave. They had a big excavator with diesel and they were digging. And so we thought that was really interesting that that was the choice for opening instead of hand digging the grave, for, the emissions, just generally speaking. We thought that was an interesting, piece.
Yeah, so that is also a choice of the green burial site,
Mhm.
what kind of equipment they use. And then
Yes.
I remember Tony mentioning a place in Freeport, I think.
Burr-
that had
Burr
traditional
Cemetery.
In different areas, and that's
Mhm.
because, do you know if they hand dig the ones in the green burial side? So that they don't have to have the.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
Yes, that they hand dig all the sites. The difference between them and the other two green cemeteries is that they're, that's the guy's making his living out of that one. The other two are more of just a service place. They charge enough to keep things going. So he charges $1,800 for a plot and $1,300 for digging or hand digging the grave. Which is the other places like will start charge $800 to $1,000 for a plot, and then whatever's the cost above that for hand digging the grave and filling it in.
The other thing to bear in mind about many of these green burial cemeteries is this question that Katie brought up about subsidence. That's a technical word for how the buried remains sink over time. Many green cemeteries that you can learn a lot just by going online and looking at pictures of them in other parts of the country. It's often a burial mound. And it's not because the body is above ground. The body is within the required depth. But because ground does settle over time, you can't just have a flat surface. So how they deal with that at Baldwin Hill, I don't know, because I didn't see any burial mounds when I went there.
Yeah, and it wasn't a mound, when
No.
they were finished. So it's interesting. I think that will be in another 10 years, we'll know. But until there's more burials there and more activity, I don't think we'll really know what the outcome will be.
Yes, the people who run Baldwin Hill could probably give you a lot more information about that. What's interesting about this whole matter is that there's a lot of misinformation about whether green burial can be taken care of in the winter. Some people assume that when the ground is frozen, you can't do this, but it goes on all year long. We have photographs we use in a slide presentation showing the green burial process going on in the dead of winter with frozen ground. So that's not a prohibition.
Hand dug or?
I can't tell you how the hole was dug.
Yeah.
The other thing that's interesting, looking at the future, is a prospect that we're not concerned about in our particular organization, but it's certainly a possibility that burial sites can be recycled. Since the body is going to decompose over time, there's no physical reason why someone else couldn't be buried in the same spot many years later. And in fact, I think archaeologically speaking, this has probably happened in the past. We, of course, are more concerned about just getting this restarted. The other thing that we have been very much concerned about in our project, as we search for land, we're actually actively looking for land where this could be used. One of the things, and now I realize you and I have been friends on
Yes.
Facebook, not Facebook, email.
Yes.
I asked Katie this because our organization is very interested in it. We have a scandalous situation nationwide, but here in Maine, big time, which with condemned land due to PFAS, this sludge that was spread on farmland. And farmers were given money in order to get rid of this toxic sludge, and then discovered that the land was unusable. Our question, which we still don't really have an answer to, is can this condemned land be used as burial land, because it would have a future that way, since the toxicity in the land wouldn't bother the remains. And we don't know, do you have any insights on that, Chuck?
No, nothing you don't know.
There's a lot of land out there that is geologically well suited to burial plots that the owners can't use for anything. So we keep trying to find out whether this would be a possibility. And if it were, this would also address the problem of the poverty involved in the owners of the land who can't do anything with it.
I can say one thing about mounding the dirt in over the grave. My wife's buried at Rainbow's End, the cemetery near Rainbow. And we, after the burial, we put the dirt right back. It was mounded right that. You go back there and look at it right now, 2 years later, it was flat ground.
I could see maybe possibly people adding dirt, like as part of a revisiting the graves over time, like we bring more stuff to kind of them.
Turned out it didn't work, didn't need it.
Chuck, in the chat, there was a question about your experience with Baldwin Hill and your wife's burial. Is there anything you'd like more to share about how that got Baldwin Hill getting started? Were you part of that?
No, I was aware of it, and I think that the first time that Kennebec Land Trust started thinking about it, they had an intern that they had him doing some research on green cemeteries, and he ended up talking to me. So that was a limit of my involvement in that.
There's also another person in the chat had a question. Did you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, Merton Durkee here from Owlsboro. I'm new to the group here and find today's discussion very interested and educatable.
Process. You take pets. Number one.
We
Do not
take
take
them
them.
at this
Okay.
time, yes.
And then do you pick up bodies and return? Is that part of the?
Licensed funeral homes. We do everything from simple cremation to traditional burials, green burials, home burials. So we do everything. Alkaline hydrolysis was just what I was asked to speak about specifically
Yeah,
today.
got it.
Yes.
Thank you.
I think I feel like there's a pet
In Scarborough?
in Scarborough that does pet alkaline hydrolysis. So
Am I-
another question?
Am I,
Yeah, as a newbie, I have so many questions and many of them I'm not asking because I know they're in future, information I can ask, but I think some of these things maybe other people might be wondering too. I think this is my last question. So I think it was Tony who was talking about how a lot of or some green the conservation type style cemetery has no marker. It's just a GPS location. What about when satellites go out? Or is there any ability for people to do any kind of marking? Do you know? In the case where they felt like, what if the technology is not there at a time I want to revisit this site?
This depends on the cemetery. Simple grave markers are actually the norm. When I said you wouldn't see tombstones like what most conventional cemeteries have that require a lot of maintenance. The regulations vary from site to site, but the general picture is that something is very simple, doesn't extend more than a certain height. Many of these places have actual regulations about the size of the stone, and people often have stones made locally. This is one of the things that's attractive about green burial, is that the shroud, the casket or basket, the stone, all of that can be made locally rather than imported or brought at some great distance. Katie could probably speak more to that. And of course, Chuck can tell you all about coffins and things like that. I do know that in military green burials, that is all regulated. The size of the stone is regulated by those rules that apply to military green cemeteries.
Yeah.
But it does vary from place to place.
We're gonna troubleshoot something here. We're gonna see, I think someone in the chat has a question, but I think it has to come through the audio on this computer. So go ahead and ask your question from Zoom.
yes, Merton Durkee here from Islesboro. Can you hear me?
Maybe?
Okay,
I think we got you.
you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. Again, my name's Merton Durkee from Islesboro. I'm new to the group. I find this chat very interesting. I've been grave digging here for 40 years. I provide assistance with both the town cemeteries and private cemeteries. I've buried most of my family. I'm very honored to do that. And my other occupation is fire chief here, continuing for 40 years. Couple of small questions. With cremations, there are state-filled document that has to be sent back to Augusta, just pertaining to cremations, and I gather that's the only way to document a cremation burial in each cemetery. I'm also finding private cemeteries and their record keeping is getting laxable at best, and I think that's a critical point. So kind of the question is, why the paperwork for the cremation that the state's only interested in? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Do you mean the authorization for burial of cremated remains? Is that what you're speaking of, Mert?
Yes, when I do a cremations, I make sure I got some kind of information, death certificate or whatever, to help and assist the form that gets sent to Augusta, that gives them the records for where these cremations happen.
Yes, and so that is a permit that should be going out with every burial of cremated remains, but it is absolutely not happening. Although when cremated remains leave the funeral home, we give them a permit if we know they're burying them, a blank permit, because we're no longer the authorized representative to bury those cremated remains. But if the family files it with the town of burial and that then eventually goes to the state, we have no control over that. So I think the permit, was issued in 2019 for authorization for burial of cremated remains. But it is in most cemeteries, even in some city-run cemeteries, not something that the sexton or superintendent is filing with the towns. We would have to file that, or it's not getting filed at all.
Exactly. And the other problem, I've come close to losing other cremations. A lot of family members will not put the cremation of the loved ones in a cemetery immediately and get a whole stack of them on the mantle and keep them 5,
Right.
10, 20 years down the line. Just experienced this year of a structure fire that had 3 cremations inside the house. Fully involved. We were lucky to get them out.
Yeah.
But it's a dangerous situation where people got to start thinking about where they should put them safer.
No, that's right. Yeah. We're gonna pass you down the line to Mel.
Hi, what was your name again, sir?
Merton.
Murden. So I agree with your concerns, and I had the same concerns kind of as a person that wanted to ensure that my own mother was documented appropriately. We just received our legal operations for the cemetery in Maine recently. And we learned that last October, the state law changed as far as legal requirement around the cemetery filling out that burial form. They are still allowed to. The Cemetery Commission wasn't actually very pleased with this. You're allowed to do it. It is not mandated that you do it. However, if the cemetery does not do that, then when the state cannot receive that paper and then choose your cemetery location as a final place of internment because they haven't been made aware. So it is the responsibility of either in Maine, it is the responsibility of either the family or the cemetery to record that paper with the state. And yeah, it's correct. I don't know how often that maybe gets misdone or not done at all. Especially now that the legal requirement from the cemetery has been dropped. However, that is exactly why we chose to create a deed addendum for every single burial. We were actually the first cemetery to use GPS coordinates and utilize that as a alternative to meets and bounds. And part of that was ensuring that we took those coordinates of that person's vital record statistics in a way that was plausible when you have multiple burials instead of just maybe a home burial, in order to list that person's vital statistics in tying to the protections of the land itself. And deed recordings and deed addendums are public record. So that is why we chose to list those coordinates, as well as any beneficiaries to that particular space are listed on the deed of the actual cemetery land in coordination with those latitude and longitude coordinates. But I agree, Martin, there is some fear around ancestral loss if these cremation and cremated remains are not properly recorded with any sort of public record keeping. And I appreciate that somebody that's been in this industry as long as you have, has that awareness, and, thank you for what you do for these families, and I'm sure you've served many people in that amount of time.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, Sarah, were we shooting for wrapping up around 12:45 or?
Or we can take some more questions and then we can mingle. We just have to, be vacating the room by 1:30.
Okay.
There was I'm so sorry, Phoebe, you've had me, but there was a question in the chat about needing to put additives with remains if you want to scatter them in a garden.
That's an excellent question. When we were establishing Life Forest in New Hampshire, I again was in the learning process. So I worked with the Department of Environmental Services Subsurface Unit. And as they were kind of reviewing our requests for what we were planning to do with the land, that particular issue came up, especially where we're trying to have a natural environment and bury in a way that is safe for the land and complementary to the land and not hurt the soil. And so I did not know that cremated remains had this kind of acidic quality. And it was asked of me at that time, and you're going to see my learning process in this, how are you going to protect the soil around it? And in my naivete, I said, well, I'm going to buy this urn and it comes with this really fancy bag and it says it's an amendment and everything's going to be just fine. And when he responded to me is like, all right, well, here's the thing. If you were doing this in a single situation, great. You're asking me for a commercial application, and what I will need to know is exactly what's in that bag. And I'm like, I don't know, it smells good, it looks good. And so he said, listen, you're gonna need to get that bag tested, and I'm gonna need to know because it's a proprietary formula. And I also want you to understand that you are asking me to use a lot of it. So if it's actually doing what it says it's going to be doing, it has the potential to burn people's hands, and therefore you will need to have an OSHA representative at your cemetery in order to use this alternative. And I was like, oh my gosh, we're getting complex here. Mother above, what am I doing? And he said, I recommend you go back to the drawing board. And that's what we did. I don't know if there's somebody that could pass around that shroud. But what we did is we hired an environmental scientist by the name of Dr. Aaron Collins. And we said, this is the problem that we've been presented with. And what he said is, listen, cremated remains over a certain amount of time will neutralize. So that acidity lasts about 3 years. And after that, it is innate. However, within that time, you are going to potentially have some damage to soil. He said, what I would recommend is using a natural wool product. I did not realize this, but historically, I guess in Europe, they've been using natural wool for burials for a very long time. But he said, as that natural wool disintegrates, not only are you protecting the land for the amount of time it needs, but it releases sulfur, nitrogen, and magnesium, which will feed the soil around that plant, tree, flower, and protect the soil while the cremated remains become innate. So that is what we do. We offer these to families who have burial. We don't charge for it. It comes with their burial plot. And a lot of times the family will shroud on their own or with us. If they choose to, they can take the wool home and dye it using hibiscus or onion peels. And we have directions on how to do that if they choose. And that's how at Life Forest we have utilized burials. As far as scattering, we don't allow scattering, so I can't speak to that. I don't know how pretty that would look scattered about. So, but we don't allow scattering for that particular reason, as well as our desire for legacy protection and point of place. And with scattering, there's not an ability to legally protect in the same way. So does that answer your question? I don't know where to go.
Yeah, it was just in the chat.
Okay. Oh, it was a check question.
I guess if people wanted to spread cremains in their garden,
Yep.
do anything to them.
You can, I mean, we have these kits. If somebody's interested, we will send you one and you can bury it with but I mean, as scattering is concerned, I can't speak to that because we don't offer it. So I didn't research around that, but if you would like to bury, the general public can purchase these. We just sell them at the cost that we get them and they can utilize them in their garden to keep them safe. So, that's all.
You had a question for a pretty long time.
Yeah.
It's really technical, like weirdly legally technical. As far as I can tell, to have a,
Just for the
I'll
microphone.
just hold it, yeah. To have a crematory in Maine, you have to have like a burying ground associated with your crematory. Am I reading that correctly? Is that true? And if so, do you know why?
I've never heard of
So yes, that was a law. I believe it's been amended since we opened our crematory, but yes, it was a law when we established our crematory. So we actually purchased space at a cemetery locally, which is why it's 4 miles from our funeral home. And so the land is part of the cemetery. It is a privately owned cemetery and we now own that portion of the land because it no longer has to be joined. Yes. But why it was put in place, I think. I believe it has, I don't know the actual amendment, but I do believe it can be separate now. But I think, my opinion as far as the law was concerned, that it was so that you didn't have crematories, funeral homes, things that were combined like that as one business. I don't know if it sprung up from a negative situation, but crematories possess a very high liability level, just operationally speaking. So to own a crematory is, I would guess, stressed to a different level, but I feel like us having our own crematory gives us peace of mind in the fact that we're not outsourcing things to a third party. So I know when my husband or my brother is operating the crematory, I know what they're doing, and I can sit with a family and say, when they're like, how do I know this is my mom? And that's a very common question. So I believe that that split probably came from some sort of separation. So it kept it separate. Crematories did this, funeral homes did this, but it makes a lot of sense for them to be combined, in my opinion. But again, it just goes down to operational standards and moral standards. Yeah.
Yeah, another question regarding green burial grounds. Could they be used as carbon offset, which I know is like kind of all the rage these days? Could that be another way that a green burial site could be, like a green burial cemetery could receive funds, would be to be used as a carbon offset?
I actually would need to call Michelle, the steward of Maine, or maybe not. But the carbon offset can be utilized through an open space program, and there's can she fill me in on that? You can actually be compensated for putting forest land into a carbon offset program. Chelsea,
I wanted to speak.
thank you.
I've done a little research on it personally. That's an excellent question. As far as I understand from my own personal research, if a landowner wants to put a portion or all of their land into a sequestration program, they can do it, regardless of if it's a conservation cemetery, a green burial cemetery, a field that used to be a cow pasture and now is full of trees 50 years later. So my understanding is that that's perfectly acceptable. There's no reason why that can't happen. And it's something I've actually researched for Life Forest in Auburn. Just exactly what you said, as just an additional appeal, allure, a function for that land is to be in a sequestration program. I think there's a number of entities that you can go through to get
that land into into a program. The one I've looked at, I think it's, Forest, I think it's called Forest Carbon Works. I'm blanking on it now, but yeah, I mean, you can Google sequestration programs and find an organization that does it, and they have different requirements. The one I looked at has a minimum of 10 acres, which is exactly the size of our cemetery. And you know, there's different levels of compensation based on the types of trees you have, the maturity of the trees you have. There's regulations on cutting, so you could, in the one I looked at, you can still do I think up to 10%. You can cut up to 10% of the trees over a certain period of time. So you're not completely restricted on never being able to cut a tree again. So there's all sorts of ways to do it. And like I said, this is just my personal research. I'm not an expert. I'm not speaking as an expert, but I have looked into this for exactly those reasons. And that my understanding is that it goes perfectly hand in hand, which is why we're looking at it. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but. Yeah.
I mean, I'm more familiar with it as a top out, so companies can continue to pollute and say, but this is our forest, see, so it's okay, we're balancing it out. Obviously, it doesn't work that way.
We need to reduce emissions and have forests. And I'm also wondering, if bodies obviously, as opposed, flame cremation will be adding to the greenhouse gases, but being buried, our carbon would be going back into the earth. So that's just an interesting thing I'll look more into is, could the human bodies in the buried ground be considered like extra carbon, sequestration in addition to the trees and the plants on that land?
If I can add to, I'm just kind of talking to you, but like, my understanding is that I believe there are some flame crematories that are utilizing programs like this to help, like you're saying, offset, okay, we're going to flame cremate this body, and of course that puts carbon into the air. So these businesses are purchasing these carbon offset programs to try and offset that. I know, for example, my father, when he was flame cremated, it said, I got his plastic box of cremains back, and there was a sticker on there that said 250 pounds of carbon offsets have been purchased in your name or what have you. So I think there's probably, maybe like you're saying, there's probably some organizations that are using it as kind of an excuse to keep. But I don't think that's necessarily true either. I think it can be a really good thing as well. But again, that's my opinion.
So thank you, everybody, and everyone on the panel as well. I think that it was very informative, and I appreciate everyone's input and everyone's questions. And with that, thank you.